Hello, everyone. My name is Lori Peak, and I am a professor of sociology and the director of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the first installment of the Making Mitigation Work webinar series, hosted by the Natural Hazard Center with the support of the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation. Mitigation is absolutely necessary to keep natural hazards from turning into human disasters. But mitigation does not work all by itself. It is up to all of us to make it happen. This new webinar series will feature innovative speakers and highlight recent progress in mitigation policy, practice, and research. We are so grateful that you have joined us today. Before we launch into the webinar, we wanted to note that this forum is being recorded. The recording and an edited version of the transcript will be posted online at the Natural Hazard Center website, hazards.colorado.edu. On behalf of the entire team here at the Natural Hazard Center, we also want to thank the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Science Foundation for their support, which has helped to make this webinar series possible. In addition, we acknowledge and thank all of you who have dialed in today. We know your time is valuable, and we appreciate your focus and attention. It is a great honor to introduce our first speaker in this new series, Angela Gladwell. Angie serves the nation as the Deputy Assistant Administrator of FEMA's Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, or FIMA, in the Risk Management Directorate of FEMA. She also co-chairs the Interagency Mitigation Framework Leadership Group, fondly known as MITFLAG, which is developing the National Mitigation Investment Strategy that you are going to hear more about today. Angie and a large and diverse team of dedicated professionals have been working tirelessly on the National Mitigation Investment Strategy. Today, you are going to learn more about the goals and recommendations and how this strategy is designed to advance a national approach to investing in mitigation and risk management across the United States. Angie will share her slides and her presentation in just a moment. Please note that for those of you who have downloaded the Zoom application, we will ask a few poll questions during this actual webinar. Unfortunately, if you're in a browser view of this webinar, Zoom limits your experience and you can't answer the polling questions. So if you need to download the application, now is the time. Otherwise, we will simply announce the results of the poll questions. To get us started, we would like to know about your background and about how you heard about this webinar. Will you please, if you have the capability, go ahead and answer this first question that should be displayed on your screen via the Zoom application. Will you please let us know into which category does your work fall? Are you with an academic institution, an international organization, federal, national, tribal, or territorial government, state government, local government, the private sector, the nonprofit or voluntary sector, a professional association, with the media, retired, not employed, or something else? So we are proud to report that we already have a 68% response rate. And just to give you a sense of who is on the line to hear this webinar today, about 12% from local government, about 23% from an academic institution, about 2% from an international organization, about 20% from federal, national, tribal, or territorial government, about 13% from state government, about 23% from the private sector, 14% from nonprofit or voluntary sector, 2% from a professional association, no one from the media, about 1% for retired or unemployed or not employed. Now, for the second poll, how did you hear about this webinar? About a third heard from the FEMA listserv. About 8% heard about it at the Natural Hazards Workshop this summer in Colorado. About 15% said that they heard about this from the Natural Hazard Center website, 11% from social media, and about 30% from other. So we're going to thank you to all of those who were able to participate in that poll. Again, you do have to have the Zoom application up and running, so apologies to those who are in your browser, but thank you to the 71% of you who were able to contribute that information. Angie has a couple of questions that she's embedded in her presentation that we'll hear shortly. So if at any point during this presentation you have questions or comments, you can share those either via the chat function or via the Q&A box that appear in your Zoom application or via the Zoom browser. You can set the chat function so either the administrators or presenters can see your comments, or everyone who is logged on to the webinar today can see them. So without further ado, thank you to everyone again for logging on and for being with us today. I am so pleased to now turn this webinar over to Angela Gladwell, and we are so looking forward to learning from you, Angie. Thank you again for kicking off this series and for your tireless work to advance mitigation for the nation.
Thank you very much, Lori. I am very excited to be here, excited to kick off the inaugural webinar series for Mitigation Works in partnership with you, and excited to talk about the National Mitigation Investment Strategy, which has been finalized today. So all of you are really hearing the details about this for the first time. We've been talking about it in broad terms for some time, and I'll talk a little bit more about where you'll be able to actually read the strategy and get more resources as we go along. So it's also good to see the distribution of who is participating with us today. No matter your organization or affiliation, you will all be important to helping us implement this strategy. So my goal today is to give you a high-level overview of how we got here, the intent and the goals of the strategy, and to begin to discuss how you can assist in the implementation and start introducing you to additional information and resources. I do also want to say specifically to the academic community as well that's participating is that we will need your help as we move forward to help us learn from your research and understanding as it relates to our goals and recommendations, and to help us identify where there are gaps of information and knowledge that we'll need to pursue together as we move forward.
Can you say what FIMA is?
Yes, FIMA is the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. It is a part of FEMA that includes both our mitigation and risk management programs, as well as federal insurance as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. So I'm going to talk to you for about 30 minutes or so with, as Lori mentioned, a few poll questions along the way, and then we'll have some time to answer your questions at the end. So the investment strategy, this strategy will provide a national approach to investments and mitigation activities and risk management across the United States for federal departments and agencies, whole community, the private and nonprofit sector entities such as businesses, philanthropies, foundations, universities, and other non-governmental organizations. As you all know, in 2017, hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, and landslides due to heavy rains and wildfires affected millions of Americans. Such natural hazards resulted in at least 500 deaths and over 1,200 injuries. Natural hazards like these are also very expensive. Since 1980, 246 weather-related disasters in the United States each caused at least $1 billion in damage. And damage from these billion-dollar disasters together totaled over $1.6 trillion. So that really is a lead-in for us to talk about how we got to develop the National Mitigation Investment Strategy. Following Hurricane Sandy and leading all the way up to those events that I just spoke about in 2017, we saw and understood that there were significant funding and dollars being allocated towards mitigation across various organizations and levels of government. But those investments were not as well coordinated and effective as they could have been. Certainly not at the federal government level, but also as you looked more broadly. And so as a result of that, the Mitigation Leadership Group, also known as the MIT-FLAG, subsequently developed a concept for a national mitigation investment strategy as a way to align, coordinate, and streamline this national mitigation investment. The final document, which is being released today as a result, is a result of a considerable amount of research, community engagement, and a substantial public comment period. So as we move forward from today, the MIT-FLAG will facilitate collaboration between the federal government and our non-federal partners to develop annual initiatives for implementation based on the investment strategy recommendations. That they will leverage existing policy to elevate awareness and participation, develop coordinated tools and resources, improve incentives, and encourage innovation. So as we move forward with implementation, we're going to be focused on broad education about what the strategy is and how others can take part, providing a focus for where we can all best provide concerted energy and effort, and then also how we're going to measure success. So at the end, how we know that we've been successful. I'd like to tell you just a minute about the Mitigation Framework Leadership Group. This is a national coordinating structure. It was authorized by the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006, and it was established to organize mitigation efforts across the federal government. It is primarily federal, but it also has state, local, tribal, and territorial representation as well. The focus of the MIT-FLAG is integrating federal efforts to deliver the mitigation core capabilities that are outlined in the National Mitigation Framework and assess the effectiveness of mitigation as they're developed and deployed across the nation. The MIT-FLAG has assumed responsibility for not only developing but also implementing the investment strategy once it's complete and periodically evaluating the success of those implementation efforts. So let's talk a little bit about the intent of the investment strategy. The strategy's overarching goal is to improve the coordination and effectiveness of mitigation investments. And these investments are defined as risk management actions taken to avoid, reduce, or transfer risks from natural hazards, including severe weather. So recognizing and respecting the local role to drive planning, development, investment priorities, and decisions, the investment strategy intends to improve the collaboration and the partnership needed to improve the effectiveness of these investments and reducing disaster suffering. catalyze innovation and investments across the whole community, and make data and risk-informed decisions that include long-term costs and risks. A common question that I've received, and I just want to answer up front, is that the strategy does focus on recommendations to mitigate risk posed by natural hazards. However, the recommendations don't exclude the implementation efforts that would also mitigate risk posed by man-made hazards as well. So I'd like to queue up our next question here, if I could. Okay. So, from your experience, which of the following actions qualify as mitigation investments? A homeowner installing roof tie-downs, a community integrating future risk into their comprehensive plan, a state collecting wildfire mitigation tax on fireworks, a private company installing rain gardens in their parking lots. And you can answer more than one.
.42% have answered so far.
Okay, we're up to 42% responding. Okay, so I think you all got the point of this question. As we look at the responses across the board, all of these actions are mitigation investment. So as we've defined mitigation investment here, it really has a very broad reach. It can range from codes to planning activities to actual affecting the built environment to incentives that also can drive mitigation. So there's a wide range of activities included here. The other point that I want to make before we move off of this slide is to emphasize that the strategy itself does not pose structural changes to existing programs. It doesn't pose new requirements or legislation. And so it's intended to be implemented within the existing authorities that we all have. However, it's also recognizing that implementation actions may identify opportunities for improvements to existing programs. So as we move forward with implementation, we may discover things that may result in changes to those programs or even potential changes to legislation. So I just wanted to clarify that. So people have asked me as we've moved forward with this the development of the NMIS about what success looks like from my point of view. And I just wanted to share a little bit of my perspective on what success looks like. Personally, for me, I feel like the investment strategy would be successful if, as a result of that, we could take big problems or areas of risk in the United States and work collectively across public and private sectors to solve them in ways that drastically reduce the loss of life and disaster suffering. So even though we're talking about mitigation investment, and a lot of that has to do with dollars and money, we're going back to the success of this is actually reducing disaster suffering, because in reality, that's really why we're all here, and it's really a central part of our mission in the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. When we think about how long people are out of their homes, or children can't go back to school, or businesses are not able to recover or don't have access to water following an event, those types of things, what we really want to do is look collectively of how we invest in mitigation in a way that, that we can reduce that disaster suffering. So we should be able, in my mind, to work with all of our partners in response and recovery and the disaster scenarios that they are playing out and preparing for, and change the outcomes of those events. And in order to do this, it means we have to fundamentally turn our traditional model of thinking of mitigation investment as a separate activity on its head. Instead, we must build the consideration of risk into how we plan, design, build our communities as we move forward. And all of that requires collective action. So it requires finding ways to link, leverage, and align our current and ongoing investments to meet the goals that we're gonna lay out in the strategy. Look for projects and efforts that can create benefits to multiple stakeholders and funders. There's so many ways that we can, as we're looking to improve our mitigation investment, look to others who have similar goals and create co-benefits and partner together on those efforts. We need to look at bringing in new partners to provide different ways of looking at the problems we're trying to solve or propose solutions. Find ways to share efforts that are having significant impacts across a large network. Use the research community to help us answer tough questions. And things like using open source data formats to facilitate information sharing. So these are some of the ways as we start to look at implementation of the investment strategy that we can collectively work together. So now if I can go to the next slide, I'm going to talk through the investment strategy goals. The investment strategy itself, and just to give you late breaking news, it was just loaded onto our FEMA website just a few moments ago. So it is there right now. And again, I'll provide that link in just a moment. But as we walk through the three goals, just a note that the strategy itself is a fairly high level document. It was intended to be that way. It has 3 goals. Each goal has a set of 3 recommendations. And it was really intended to provide a broad framework for future implementation action. So I'm going to walk through each of these goals. As the other thing to identify here as we go, before I go through the goals, is that there are also a number of principles that are important to each of these goals and recommendations. One, that this strategy applies to the whole community. So again, it's not federally focused. It's meant to engage everyone in finding ways to improve mitigation investment. It has a fundamental underpinning of regional and community planning that are really foundational for the success of this strategy. It factors in the fact that nature-based solutions and natural assets are also a very important way for us to achieve some of the goals and recommendations in this strategy. It looks for ways that we can link risk reduction and financial risk transfer together. It acknowledges changing conditions, and by changing conditions, I mean changes to various factors that influence risk, whether that's the built environment, the natural environment, changing weather patterns, and other things that are important for us to consider. And it also considers that there are populations that are much more vulnerable to disasters than others, and that we need to be thinking about how our goals and our recommendations apply to those populations and can address their needs. With that, let me just walk through the 3 goals. So goal 1 is to show how mitigation investments reduce risk. We want to provide stakeholders with a foundational understanding of how mitigation investment protects what they value. The second goal is to coordinate mitigation investments to reduce risk. The objective there is to foster better understanding of risks, to support investment decisions, assure alignment of programs and incentives towards risk reduction goals, and reduce complexity and access to investment funds. And the third goal is to make mitigation investment standard practice. Here, the objective is to assure that national stakeholders are participating in mitigation activities, especially decisions to enhance building codes and infrastructure standards and the use of financial products that link to mitigation. So let me just walk through each of these individually. So goal one of the things that we learned as we were developing this investment strategy is that mitigation is complex and poorly understood. People, as they hear terms mitigation, resilience, and sustainability, really had a hard time digesting what it is that we meant or what we really wanted them to do. And so the first recommendation is really about them making mitigation investments relevant. To understand what people care about, which may be different from one place or audience to another, understand what they care about, and be able to articulate mitigation in terms that relate to those things that people care about. And I'm going to provide you just some examples of how of that in just a moment. The second recommendation is increasing mitigation investment by building the capacity of communities to address their risks. So this is not just talking about more, this is really talking about being able to easily share information. So creating the professional networks around and focused on mitigation to be able to share information easily about resources, tools, leading practices. It also includes consideration of professionalizing mitigation. We're now working in a multidisciplinary environment because we are dealing with complex problems that need a lot of different types of expertise in order to solve them. And so what does it mean to actually be able to build mitigation expertise into those professions in a way that engineers, for example, are automatically thinking about how they're designing infrastructure to last for the full life cycle of that infrastructure, or planners are automatically thinking about the risks and how they can bring their expertise to bear as communities are figuring out and planning for their future. And then the third recommendation is using common measures to aid decision-making for mitigation investment. So this is really how do we have some common language to know when we've been successful? So if we've retrofitted buildings, how do we know what to expect in terms of their performance over different types of events? And how do we have some common tools to really understand what we've done and how successful it may perform in different hazardous situations? If we go to the next slide, when we talk specifically about making mitigation relevant, we start talking in some common language about how we make neighborhoods and homes safer, how we strengthen the ability for communities to get back to normal more quickly after a disaster, how we protect jobs and personal finances, how we prevent injury and loss of life, how we reduce suffering after a disaster, and how we protect areas that are important to a community, whether that's a historic district or another part of a community that's very important to them. Again, if we start to understand specifically what's important to those communities, then we can start using these types of terms to talk about what we're trying to achieve. If we move on to goal two for me, is really the heart of why we developed the National Mitigation Investment Strategy. It was about coordination and alignment on why we got started down the road of developing the strategy itself. And although you don't see planning in the specific recommendations that are outlined here, I do again want to emphasize that planning really is the kind of underpinning to make all of this work. And so the first recommendation is about making risk information more available and easier to use. So an example of that is the work that we're doing here in FEMA on transforming the National Flood Insurance Program. We understand that as we look at you look at a line on a map to depict a floodplain, that is really not a good signal to people about whether they are at risk for flooding or not. At the same time, there's varieties of risk information, both on the hazards, but also on the built environment and the social environment and other things that are really important for people to understand their risk. And we need to be able to make that accessible and share that in ways that people can use and use to meet their own needs. We may provide one set of information to a homeowner who is trying to make a decision of whether they might be living in a risky area. Then we may be to a community that's developing a new development or those types of things. So how do we make that information easily shareable and tee it up in the ways that people can make decisions? The second recommendation is aligning program requirements and incentives. So this is about looking at where programs are working at potentially cross purposes at one another, or whether they can actually reinforce, if they were aligned, reinforce some common goals towards mitigation investment by having requiring common building standards, for example, or looking at having common incentives across the board. So this is about how can we better align those programs. It's also, from a customer point of view, is also how can we then make it easier to align funding sources to meet the needs of people that need multiple funding sources to accomplish their mitigation goals. So whether they're looking to combine HUD and FEMA funding, or they have philanthropy that might be contributing a large share and a federal grant, how do we help them better align that funding and match that funding so that they can accomplish those goals? And then the third recommendation is really about making access to the funding easier. How do we streamline that access to funding so the application process is easier to understand and to complete? And how do we address those hurdles that may prevent some for not applying for the money that is available? So some of the ways that you can help coordinate mitigation investments to reduce risk is, one, if you own or have risk information, is sharing that risk information. Integrating the consideration of current and future risk into planning efforts. I think one of our goals here is there are so many different planning requirements and efforts. How can we integrate those together and also ensure that, again, mitigation planning is not thought about separately, but is really integrated into all the other planning efforts that exist. Aligning risk priorities across multiple organizations and sectors. Use and align incentives towards common goals. Leverage public and private partnerships. And simplify applications or processes for funding. So no matter your role and responsibility as you're on this webinar today, are there ways that you can step in to any of these areas to be able to help implement the recommendations under this goal?
We are referring to all federal programs, not just FEMA and FIMA. And so I will go ahead and hand it back to Angie, but that one seemed time sensitive.
Thank you. Okay, so let's now go into goal 3. Goal 3 is making mitigation investment standard practice. So I like to refer to this goal as creating a tipping point. So that every investment is considering what risks it needs to be thinking about as you're building that investment, and is building mitigation into those investment decisions. Most of the funding across the nation, for example, for infrastructure occurs at the local level. And so as capital improvement planning is being done, or other investment decisions are being made, the goal here is really for all of those decisions to think about risks and mitigation. So the first recommendation is encouraging communities to adopt and enforce up-to-date building codes. We know that codes and standards are the foundation of resilience. And we know that for every dollar invested in the latest codes, we save $11. And so it makes financial sense for communities to be using the latest codes. And so we want to look at and understand, as part of this, what are some of the barriers for adopting the latest codes, and how can we work to change that, both from the adoption and the enforcement side. The second recommendation is strengthen critical infrastructure and lifelines. So as we think about following a major disaster, it's critical that communications are working, power, water, emergency services, that those are all functioning as quickly as possible after an event. Hospitals need to be up and running, but they also need to be accessible. The roads getting there also have to be open. And so this recommendation is really about how we look at this holistically on what is most critical and those interdependencies, and how we address strengthening those as part of our mitigation investment strategy. And then the third recommendation is using and expanding financial products and approaches to reduce and transfer risk. So we know that financial tools drive action and help people, and things like insurance helps people recover more quickly and more fully. And so we want to be able to look at what are those financial products and tools that can really be used to help drive the mitigation actions that will protect people as they move forward. So again, those are things like tax credits and incentives, bond ratings, insurance, all of those other kind of financial products and tools. So what does it mean to make mitigation investment standard practice? It means that whole communities are safe, not only specific parts of communities. What we want to try to move away from is the siloed approach to mitigation. So we may be addressing the housing need, but we haven't been addressing the transportation or the infrastructure around those homes. So we want to address this in a way that's really more holistic in nature. Every current and future investment considers mitigation, especially for buildings and infrastructure. Building codes and standards are up to date, and insurance, grants, tax incentives, bond ratings, and other financial tools drive investment. So that's what it means to us for mitigation investment to be standard practice. Okay, so we are now going to move on to another poll question.
There it is.
Okay. Okay, so I'll just walk through at a very high level the 3 goals. We're interested in which goal you are most excited to see implemented. And again, you can choose more than one. Okay, so they're very close, but goal 3 has a slight edge, and I'm with you all. I tend to lean towards goal 3 myself, but what's exciting to me about this is that I do think that all the goals work together very well. I think as we start thinking about our implementation efforts, and we've been thinking about how we're going to move forward with implementation, it was clear that it didn't make sense in a lot of cases for us to just pick one recommendation or one goal as an area of focus, that we want to look at ways and how they can work together to be able to be effective. I want to just highlight one particular effort as an example of that. We have been working with the Federal Alliance of Safe Homes, FLASH, and partnered with them on an effort they've been leading to improve building code awareness. And as part of that effort, they really were targeting the consumer to really understand how people felt about building codes. And one of the things that they learned through that effort, through focus groups and other collection methods, is that one, people didn't think a lot about building codes, which was really important information for us to know, but also that they had high expectations for their local officials for ensuring that there were codes in place. They had high expectations for their builders on what they were building. And also they had very strong reactions in situations where there was no code, or even the thought that there was no code. And so that really is a goal 1 type of activity on really understanding consumers to really make the work that we're doing relevant to them. But then it was very much focused on goal 3 on facilitating the adoption and enforcement of building codes, because what FLASH was able to do with that was to be able to develop a campaign that really targeted those consumers, to equip them with information where they could enter their address and their zip code and some very simple information to determine, do they have a code or not, and an updated code or not? And if not, what are some ways that they could equip them to take the next steps to be able to get this information? So these are some of the ways that we can see that these recommendations can work together as we move forward. So for us to be successful, it's really important that, one, we spread the message about this this strategy and this vision of the future as far and wide as that we possibly can, and that we all see ourselves as having a role in implementing this strategy. This is really where the whole community, again, no matter your role, can find a place where you can all move this strategy forward. Plus, there is a role for the federal government and also for some critical non-federal partners to be able to work together to advance this strategy. You know, one of those examples is the partnership that currently we have and why we're here today and partnering with the Natural Hazards Center is because we know that as we move forward in this implementation of this strategy, that linking that research to practice is going to be so important to our success, to be able to all grapple with the tough questions we're grappling with in the policy space, but then understand what the research community has learned about these efforts to inform us and how we move forward. And so that's just one example of those types of partnerships. And overall, then our goal is for that to result in less disaster suffering. This is an important opportunity that we can grab hold on and use to be able to move the mitigation effort forward. We can use this to be able to create a spark of energy to say the current suffering that's happening in this nation doesn't have to occur. We can work together in new and different ways to be able to change those outcomes, and we can use this as a way to be able to spark that dialogue and create the demand for that to occur. So I'm going to just provide a note on where you can actually go to get the strategy today, and then I'm going to open things up to questions. So the strategy has been loaded onto this website, www.fema.gov/National Mitigation Investment Strategy. There will be a podcast that will be launched tomorrow that is also can be used to share information and kind of a discussion in addition to this webinar about the strategy and its intent. And there will be some substantial information shared on social media and other avenues starting later today. So those are some initial sources for you to go to. We also have an email, FEMA-INMIS@fema.dhs.gov. So if you have specific questions or comments that you want to share with us, please let us know. And at this juncture, I would like to just pause and see what questions people have.
All right, and we've got Lori who's going to proctor the questions for us, and she's monitoring both the question and answer box as well as the chat.
So hi again, everyone. This is Lori Peak at the Natural Hazard Center, and I had the gift of welcoming you to this wonderful webinar, and now to thank Angie for that presentation and to transition into questions. We have a little less than 10 minutes remaining and would like to dive into some of these great questions that you all have shared. And so Angie, one of the first questions that popped up here is really wanting to understand, does the National Mitigation Investment Strategy address the progressive impacts of both slow onset or chronic disasters, such as land subsidence issues, coastal erosion, sea level rise, in addition to those more acute onset natural hazard events that you named, like earthquakes, tornadoes, et cetera?
That is a great question. And the intent is for the strategy is to address those as well. So one of the things that I mentioned was kind of an overarching kind of guiding principle is that we would be considering changing conditions in the strategy. So as you think about things like coastal erosion and sea level rise and those types of issues, and again, combined with other issues that change, again, as populations move, as the built environment changes, all of those things changes the risks that may exist in a particular area. The goal is that the investment strategy and the recommendations therein would be utilized to help address those issues, yes.
Nice, thank you. We have another question that's trying to dig a little deeper into the coordination that you referred to in the first part of the webinar. So the question was there any coordination between the development of the National Mitigation Investment Strategy and the currently developing BRIC grant and BRIC work?
Absolutely. So we've had great partnership with our mitigation directorate partners on this. And so that has occurred throughout the process. I think that BRIC is a really important opportunity as that moves out. And for those that are not aware of that, that is a new FEMA grant program that has recently been authorized that will provide a new source of pre-disaster funding for communities. And so from my perspective, that provides a great federal example of pre-disaster mitigation and how important that shift in focus is for us. I think the goal is then how are we going to really leverage that? Because when you think about what the need is throughout the country, even in times where there's high disaster activity and that program is much larger than other years, it still is only a very small portion of what is really needed in the country. So there's great examples out there. And one of my recent favorites that I learned about is a library at the University of Utah that just did a substantial seismic retrofit that used some pre-disaster mitigation, but really use that to highlight and leverage the need to do the seismic retrofit and funded most of it through private philanthropy. And so it's a good way to be able to take the federal dollars that you have and really leverage them to get and maximize your impact. So I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Angie. And we have another question. They're really pouring in, so I want to say to everybody who's on the line, we know we're not going to get to all of them. We will post the webinar and we'll post the questions and some written answers to these great questions. So with our time remaining, here is another one, Angie. One of our participants really wanted you to go a little deeper in terms of talking about vulnerable populations, and especially vulnerable populations who are in areas that are subject to multiple natural hazards. And so can you talk to us about how this strategy is addressing vulnerable populations and communities that are at risk to multiple and perhaps growing natural hazards threats?
So I guess what I can say is this is, again, an overarching principle that is really important to us in the implementation of the strategy. So we're still very much maturing on our approach to the implementation of the strategy, but from my perspective right now is that what we want to do as we move forward is we want to choose some areas of focus. So we want to say over the first year or two, this is what we want to focus on and accomplish. And based on how we frame that, then we want to think about some of these other principles as they apply to that focus area. So based on that, then what does that mean for vulnerable populations? What then do we need to be thinking about with regard to multiple hazards for this particular implementation area? And we would be factoring those things into that implementation approach. So, you know, an example would be, let's say we are going to work on a national strategy to improve the adoption and enforcement of building codes. Well, we know that we would think about that in terms of what are some of the barriers to be able to do that. So for example, we know affordability of housing is an issue, and one of the reasons that those codes may not be adopted. And so that would then factor into, okay, then what are the options in front of us? How do we better understand what those issues are and what's really contributing? And how do we use that to craft our range of solutions? So that's just an example of how it might be factored in as we move forward.
Thank you. We have a question about how to get information to communities for communities that are interested in accessing federal funding for mitigation, and perhaps some of these other mitigation funding sources you referred to, Angie. And so how do communities learn about where the dollars are and how they can advance mitigation investments?
Well, that's a great question. It's also a broad question. So there's lots of different sources that are available right now. I know that one of our upcoming webinars is going to be focused on the BRIC program itself. So just as a plug for that, if you want to learn more about that program, it's a good opportunity to do that. But that's part of kind of what we're looking at as we move forward, because one of the things that we've again learned is just having the basic information about what programs are available to support mitigation, I find is one of the most critical kind of pain points that people have. And so one of the things that we'll be exploring is how do we provide that resourcing. We could likely provide something that's consolidated at a national level. How do then we build off of that to more state and localized information that can share these various programs and available funding sources. So we have a lot of work to do in that area. But at least we know what the problem is, so that's one step in the right direction.
Absolutely. And Angie, what is clear from this webinar is that there are many steps ahead, but this is a giant leap forward. I want to, again, thank you so much for this presentation. And I am so sorry that we are nearing the end of our time. And so I want to say to all of the persons on the webinar who put questions in the chat and in the Q&A box, again, we will download all of those. We'll work with Angie and Jamie Lee and their entire team to see if we can get some written responses, which we will share on the Natural Hazard Center Making Mitigation Work webinar series page, along with this wonderful presentation from Angie, the recording of it, and her slides. And so please do know you can check back at hazards.colorado.edu for those resources, as well as we will be adding a link to the hot off the presses National Mitigation Investment Strategy that we were so pleased to hear Angie announce today. So just in closing, we again want to thank Angie Gladwell for this thoughtful and thorough presentation, for sharing the background that led to the creation of the National Mitigation Investment Strategy, but also for really emphasizing how we can all work together to advance the goals and recommendations that are included in this strategy. In addition to thanking Angie for this outstanding presentation, we also want to again offer our thanks to the Federal Emergency Management Agency and to the National Science Foundation for making this Making Mitigation Work webinar series possible. And to all of those on the webinar, we hope that you will mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will be on Tuesday, September 10th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. That webinar will feature Professor Keith Porter, who has helped to lead recent Mitigation Saves work for the nation, and he will be speaking on the topic of ethical and efficient infrastructure resilience, the battle for better building codes. You can find more information on that, and again, information from this webinar at hazards.colorado.edu. And with that, we end with a final round of gratitude to all of you for the work that you do to advance natural hazards mitigation. Thank you for joining us for this first Making Mitigation Work webinar. And thank you again to Angela Gladwell and FEMA. Best wishes, everyone.
Thank you, Lori.